This is part two of how Cardano is going to fundamentally change the corporate landscape. Get ready. Let's go. In part one, we talked about some pretty drastic changes to the employer-employee relationship that could be wrought by Cardano smart contracts. This time, we're going to talk about some wider sweeping changes that could come about for the same reason. This can also create a lot of transparency about the company for the employee. Anybody who's worked in a startup knows that one of the things that always happens is the employees never really know how long the startup's going to be around for, right? It's like they kind of know, like, hey, we've done a series A and a series B, but we don't know if the company is going to get its series C. If it doesn't get its series C, maybe bad things happen, maybe it's not a big deal, but we don't actually know how much money the company has. Certainly there's startups out there that tell the employees, like, hey, our runway is this, we have this much money, we got to get our next round of funding before we run out of money, which will happen on this date at our current burn rate. But a lot of startups don't do that. With this kind of smart contract driven approach, the company could just escrow payroll, right? Then, even if they don't want to tell the employees how much total money they have, they could show on the blockchain, hey, employees, don't worry and start looking for their jobs because we've escrowed enough payroll to last until the end of the year. So you're good. And before the end of the year, we're going to fix everything and we're going to escrow even more money. So that money is escrowed on the blockchain. We can't take it out. It can only go to you guys. So don't worry about us stealing from the escrowed payroll. We're not going to repurpose that because we can't. It's on the blockchain, escrowed. It can only go to you guys as we move forward in time. This would also provide greater transparency for investors because while we've been talking about running the corporation on a smart contract for the employer-employee relationship, we can actually do this with everything for the corporation. For instance, we could put all the financials of the corporation on the blockchain. The balance sheet, the revenues received, the costs. This could all, currently a lot of companies keep this in internal systems. And if they're a private company, they certainly don't want this out there. If they're a public company, they have to file with regulatory authorities so the investors can see. But with a lot of private companies, that's well-guarded information. And the investors through the board, through the representation on the board of directors, can often see that information, quarterly, yearly, but they can't see it on the fly. And they really only get to see what the company presents to them. If that were all on the blockchain, then the investors could see all of it. Even just in the context of this employer-employee relationship, there would be all kinds of metrics on human capital that could be seen on the blockchain. Like, how big are the queues for all the roles, for all the different jobs within the company? If the queues are gigantic, that would show that people out there really want to work for the company. Maybe that's a reflection of the company's really good work culture. Maybe people really believe in the mission of the company. Investors could also see how big are the turnover rates. This would be tremendous amount of transparency compared to what investors and would-be investors can see today. And it could, if done correctly, could also be done in a way that investors could trust it much more. Obviously, if revenues are coming in on the blockchain and costs are reflected in the blockchain because they're being paid through the blockchain, they can trust that information. So if we're saying that the company's revenue is coming into the smart contract through which the employees will interact with the company, why don't we just go ahead and say that this is a company that's engaging in commerce based on cryptocurrencies, probably like a stable coin that's running on Cardano at this point. If that's the case, they could basically reflect all of their revenue and costs would already be reflected on the blockchain, right? We can come up with the exceptions where there might be some cost or, something like that that's not reflected on the blockchain. But we could get to a point where, the vast majority of the revenues and costs are reflected on the blockchain. And then accounting which is a huge cost center for corporations, becomes a public event, right? We already have this a little bit. When large public corporations file their quarterly and annual reports, we have a million pundits and commentators coming out of the closet saying they should have accounted for these costs in this way. They should have characterized this revenue in this way. They already quibble with corporations about their accounting. Under this scenario, accounting could be this public event where the company wouldn't even necessarily have to do it. If all the activity is already reflected in the blockchain, the world can just come to its own conclusion about what the accounting actually looks like, because all the data is already available to them. Obviously, that's a much better scenario for would-be investors in private corporations, where they currently have to trust a company to accurately account for all of its activities. But this brings up a more fundamental question about those would-be investors who become shareholders if they actually buy a piece of the company. So if all of the accounting is happening on chain and the employees are all interacting with the company through a smart contract, does anybody really need to own the company anymore? What if the smart contract just laid out the shares of revenue and profit that each role in the company gets? What if the company no longer paid the employees a fixed amount every week? What if it was just some small percentage of the total revenue or profit? So I say revenue or profit because in a startup scenario, obviously nobody's going to work for it if they only get, if it's an early stage startup and there are no profits, nobody's going to work for that company. It'll never have profits, right? We have a catch-22. So in the startup scenario, it would have to be revenue as the company runs in the negative. And then for a profitable company, it might actually be profit. So the way this would happen, right? So we've got everybody working at the company, 2 weeks at a time. And they're kind of choosing which smart contract they're working for this month, right? And there will be no problems with accountability, right? It's like workers on the teams in the company will still report to managers. Managers will still report to directors. Directors will still report to vice presidents. Vice presidents can report to the CEO. And there we run into a problem. Who does the CEO report to if there are no shareholders, no owners of the company, and therefore no board of directors? Luckily, we have this concept of a DAO. It could be a distributed autonomous organization, but instead of it issuing tokens and all the token holders of the DAO being the ones who get to vote and tell the CEO what to do, it can be all of the people working for this smart contract, which is no longer really a corporation. It's not a corporation anymore. It's a smart contract, right? This changes a lot of different things. You might say to yourself, what about the liability protection of the corporation? Didn't we say that a corporation is just a division of ownership and liability? What if the corporation does something dumb and it gets sued? Well, it's going to change litigation and commercial conflict in big ways. So if we have a very liquid job market, a very liquid employment market, and the corporation gets sued, and it's a really big lawsuit that could materially damage the ability of the corporation to make money going forward, or might create such a big indenture on the corporation because of the liability that's been incurred, all the employees would just bail. And the value of the corporation would go way down. So the incentive for people to sue the corporation would be much, 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 much lower, right? And all the people in the corporation would probably go more out of their way to prevent the corporation from being sued, because the corporation gets sued and they all have to bail and go to the bottom of the queues for roles in other companies. That's not good for them. So they're going to try hard not to get the corporation sued. And people aren't really going to want to sue the corporation because there's no owners of the corporation. Sure, you might say, hey, but the corporation probably owns assets. Yeah, that's probably true. But there would be no owners owning shares of the corporation who could get sued. You could say, like, okay, they could sue for the percentage rights to the revenue held by the employees. But again, those revenues are going to dry up if all the employees bail and go into the queues to go work at other corporations. Those corporations would still compete with each other. If somebody thought they could do a better job than any of the smart contracts that are currently in that industry doing that particular thing in the economy, they can just start their own smart contract, try to attract other employees to join with them. You could have all the same incentives you have in our current system. It could be just as capitalist. The scary part of all this is that everything we just talked about with respect to smart contracts replacing corporations, you could you could extend that thinking and ask, how come smart contracts couldn't replace nation states? How come, and probably not one smart contract, but how come a if a nation state is just, collection of taxes beyond common ideals, right? We could talk all day about common ideals and how that brings people together or it doesn't, but you could say that economically a nation state is collection of taxes and provision of benefits. If that's all a nation state is economically, then you could probably also do that with smart contracts to the same extent they could replace corporations. And then you could also have a similar race to the bottom where different smart contracts will offer lower and lower taxes while providing some bundle of benefits. Hey, we're still going to have police in your neighborhood. We're still going to have firemen in your neighborhood. We're still going to have, health care for the poor, but we're going to tax you at 17%, not 29% in your income bracket. That's the really interesting, scary piece. All this stuff about corporations possibly could also apply to nation states. And maybe this starts in failed nation states, right? Maybe somebody goes to Venezuela and they start this for some neighborhood in Caracas, right? They're like, hey, the government has failed. It's a failed government. uh, Start throwing your Cardano tax dollars into this smart contract, and we'll provide you with police protection, fire protection, healthcare, all these various services that the government is no longer providing you with. And then maybe, who knows, maybe that movement could grow from there. There are a lot of, I think, really wide sweeping implications of a blockchain that actually works and has smart contracts that actually work. A lot to think about, and probably a lot that we're going to actually experience over the next 10 years. Talk to you tomorrow.